Amelia's story begins with her desperate struggle to escape from a life filled with cruelty and control. Her parents' harsh treatment left scars that went far beyond the physical, and Amelia longed for freedom and kindness. One cold night, as she fled from her torment, she encountered John, a homeless man who, like her, had suffered the indifference of the world. Their unexpected meeting sparked a connection that changed both of their lives forever. As Amelia risked everything to help John, she discovered her own strength and compassion, and in return, John found hope and purpose once again. Together, they overcame unimaginable obstacles, from escaping their painful pasts to building a future filled with love, kindness, and purpose. Their journey is a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and the belief that even in the darkest of times, there is always light if we choose to see it. Through their charity, Light for Tomorrow, they turned their pain into a beacon of hope for others, proving that one act of kindness can indeed change the world. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. A fragile young woman named Amelia, desperate to break free from the suffocating chains of her cruel parents, sought refuge in the shadows of the night. Her heart pounded as she attempted to escape the endless torment that had stripped her of her innocence. Her parents had bruised not only her skin but also her spirit, their harsh treatment leaving invisible scars that cut deeper than the physical ones she always hid beneath her worn, tattered coat. Her days were filled with silent tears, falling like broken dreams, as she often asked herself, "Will anyone ever love me? Am I destined to be unloved forever?" Amelia crept cautiously down the dimly lit hallway, her breath hitching every time the floor beneath her feet threatened to betray her with a creak. She was all too familiar with the consequences of waking her parents, the violent outbursts, the unrelenting anger that seemed to have no end. The bruises on her arms told the story of their cruelty, but they remained concealed, just like her fear and yearning for freedom. Tonight she was determined to escape, determined to prove to herself that she deserved more than this life of pain. When she finally reached the kitchen, her hand shook as she retrieved a small bowl of soup she had cleverly hidden in the back of the fridge. It was all she had managed to save, the only thing she had left to sustain her on her journey to freedom. Her parents, always vigilant about controlling her every move, had locked away all the good food, leaving her to survive on scraps. Her stomach growled with hunger, but Amelia knew she couldn't eat it now. No, she needed to save it for later when she was far away from this nightmare. With the soup tucked safely into her worn bag, she approached the front door, her pulse racing. Every movement was deliberate, every sound a potential threat to her escape. Just as she turned the key in the lock, the bed in her parents' room groaned under their weight. Amelia, her father's gruff voice echoed through the silence, sending a jolt of terror through her. She froze, praying he was merely shouting in his sleep as he often did. If he caught her trying to leave, she knew what awaited her: another beating, another day of anguish. After what felt like an eternity, though only moments had passed, Amelia finally mustered the courage to slip out the door, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. Outside, the cool night air embraced her, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to dream of a better future, a future where she could learn to read, find a job, and never have to endure the gnawing pain of hunger again. "I will make it. I just need to run," she whispered to herself, clinging to that fragile hope. But as she stepped onto the cold pavement, her escape was interrupted by a voice, a weak, raspy voice calling her name. Her eyes darted toward the alley, where a thin, ragged beggar sat slumped against the wall. His appearance was pitiful, tangled hair, clothes hanging loosely on his emaciated frame, and a face etched with both grime and an unexpected beauty that time and hardship couldn't erase. He looked up at her, startled that she had even noticed him, let alone acknowledged his existence. How many people must pass him by without a second thought, Amelia wondered, her heart aching at the sight of someone suffering just as she had. For a fleeting moment she hesitated, torn between her desire for freedom and the pull of compassion for another lost soul, alone in the cold night. Despite her parents' harsh treatment, a cruel routine of mistreatment and control, Amelia still received a small bowl of food each day, just enough to survive, but never enough to fill the emptiness that gnawed at her soul. But as she looked at the man before her, sitting with nothing but the cold to keep him company, she realized that he had even less. The sight of his frail frame and hollow eyes stirred something deep within her, a mixture of pity and empathy that softened the edges of her own pain. She concluded that whatever hunger she felt, his must be worse, a constant ache gnawing at him with no relief in sight. With her heart heavy with compassion, she slowly approached him, the bowl of food still clutched in her trembling hands. She hesitated for a moment, then gently extended it toward him. "I don't know your name," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "But it looks like you need this more than I do." Her words hung in the chilly night air, sincere and filled with a desire to ease even a fragment of someone else's suffering. The dim light from a nearby street lamp briefly illuminated his face, casting shadows that softened the hard lines of his worn features. For the first time, she saw something that had long been absent from his eyes: gratitude, fleeting yet unmistakable. He accepted the bowl with hands that shook from more than just the cold. "John," he said, his voice raspy and weak from both exhaustion and disbelief. "My name is John. And you must be Amelia," he added, his words surprising her as much as his sudden recognition. Her heart skipped a beat, and she took a step back, suspicion creeping in. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice now tinged with caution. The night was supposed to be her ally, her cover as she fled, but this unexpected encounter unsettled her. John studied her face, his eyes searching hers for a moment before he answered. "I overheard someone shouting your name as I passed by earlier." He looked down at the bowl in his hands, his expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. "But why?" he asked, his voice thick with the weight of a life filled with disappointment. "Why are you doing this for me?" Amelia glanced around nervously, ensuring the night still protected them with its dark, comforting silence. She took a deep breath, her confession coming out in a whisper, as if sharing it with the night itself. "Because I know what it's like to be hungry," she said, the truth of those words settling heavily in the space between them. Admitting it felt like releasing a burden she had carried for too long, yet at the same time, it bound her to him in this shared vulnerability. "I can't just run away and leave you here, not knowing if you'll survive the night." John looked at her with newfound interest, his weathered face softening for the first time in what must have been years. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, more a shadow of hope than happiness. "And you think you can save the world?" he asked, but his words held no sarcasm, only a quiet, curious wonder at this unexpected kindness. Amelia felt a new strength rising within her, a resolve that had been missing in all her years of suffering. "Maybe I can't save the world," she said firmly, feeling that conviction grow stronger with every word, "but I can try to make a difference where it matters." She gestured toward an old shack at the end of the street, a place she had passed by many times and knew could offer temporary shelter. "You can stay there tonight. It's not much, but it's warmer than out here. I'd hate to think of you freezing while I run off to save myself." John nodded, his eyes reflecting a tired but grateful acceptance. Without a word, he followed her to the small, rundown shack. Inside, it was dark and cramped, but it offered some protection from the biting cold outside. He placed the bowl of food carefully on an improvised table, his rough hands lingering for a moment, as if absorbing the warmth it symbolized. "You have a good heart, girl," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of many hard years. "Too good for this cruel world." Amelia smiled sadly, feeling the bitter irony of his words. "Just trying to be the person my parents never were," she replied, the truth of her own words sinking in as she said them. She turned to leave, the urgency of her escape still pulsing through her veins, but she couldn't ignore the lingering connection she felt to this man. this stranger who had unexpectedly crossed her path. "Stay safe, John, if you need anything else. I'll try to help when I can," and with that, she slipped back into the night, her heart both heavier and lighter all at once. As Amelia quietly left the small shack behind, a heaviness settled in her heart, a feeling she couldn't ignore. No matter how desperate she was to escape her own nightmare, leaving John behind, starving and weak, felt wrong. She couldn't bring herself to abandon him in that state. "He needs the food more than I do," she thought with a pang of empathy. Resolving to stay a little longer at her parents' house, she promised herself that once John was stronger and well-fed, she would make her escape. She clung to this promise, knowing that her freedom could wait if it meant helping someone in need. Returning home with the same careful steps she had taken when leaving, she crept back inside under the cover of early dawn. Her parents were still asleep, their harsh voices and controlling hands momentarily at rest. Amelia slipped into the kitchen, determined to carry out her new plan. With deliberate precision, she began preparing breakfast, knowing her parents wouldn't allow her to eat much of what she cooked. But this morning she had a different purpose in mind. She cooked a little extra, all the while convincing herself that she was merely trying to please her parents. "If I do this every day, they won't even notice the difference," she murmured to herself as she carefully stirred the pot of pork, the aroma filling the small kitchen. The plan was simple but fraught with risk. If her parents discovered her secret generosity, the consequences would be harsh, perhaps unbearable. Amelia's mind raced with the possibilities, but she pushed the fear down, focusing on the task at hand. She placed the extra portion of porridge into a small container, her hands steady but her heart pounding in her chest. Just as she was about to slip away unnoticed, she heard the unmistakable sound of her mother's footsteps descending the creaky stairs. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to remain calm, to act natural. "Good morning," Mother Amelia said, mustering a smile that barely reached her eyes. "I thought I'd make a more substantial breakfast for you today." Her voice trembled slightly, but she fought to keep it steady. Her mother eyed her with thinly veiled suspicion, her sharp gaze scanning the kitchen. "Food isn't cheap, and you eat too much," she snapped, her words laced with bitterness. Without warning, her mother's hand shot out, slapping Amelia hard across the face. The sharp sting brought tears to Amelia's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry. "This is to teach you not to waste food," her mother spat. "You will not eat more than one bowl today." Amelia nodded, swallowing the pain that threatened to choke her. She forced herself to sit at the table and eat what little she was allowed, barely 3 spoonfuls before her mother took the bowl away. Each bite felt like a struggle, not only against her hunger but against the injustice of it all. She knew she couldn't let her mother notice she had cooked more than usual next time. She had to be smarter, more careful. Her body may have been weak, but her mind was determined. As soon as an opportunity presented itself, Amelia grabbed the hidden container of food and quietly slipped out the back door, her heart racing with the thrill of both fear and hope. The sting of her mother's slap still burned on her cheek, but she ignored it, focusing on her mission. Every step she took carried the weight of responsibility, but also the faint glimmer of purpose that had been missing for so long. When she finally reached the shack, she found John still asleep, curled up in a corner, seeking warmth from the cold air that crept in through the cracks. Her heart ached for him, for the life that had led him to this moment. "John," she whispered, kneeling beside him and gently touching his shoulder. "Wake up. I brought something for you to eat." John stirred slowly, blinking as he woke, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and gratitude as they met hers. "You really came back," he rasped, his voice hoarse with disbelief. It was as if he couldn't quite believe someone had cared enough to return for him. He glanced at the container in her hands, then back at her. "Have you eaten?" he asked, concern lining his weary features. Amelia hesitated, touched by his unexpected question. She forced a smile, her heart swelling with both sadness and hope. "Don't worry about me," she said softly. You need this more than I do." The weight of her own hunger was nothing compared to the weight of knowing she was helping someone who truly needed it. Amelia settled beside John, placing the warm bowl of porridge between them. The steam rose into the chilly air, a small comfort in the biting cold. "Yes, I ate a little," she lied softly, not wanting to burden him with her own hunger. "But don't worry about me. I can't promise much, but I'll help as long as I can," she added, her resolve growing stronger as she saw the flicker of relief in his tired eyes. She didn't have much to offer, but she had her determination, and that had to be enough for now. John, to her surprise, didn't dig into the food immediately. Instead, he picked up the spoon and offered it to her. "Eat a bit more," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. He could see through her brave facade, and it tugged at something in him, a need to give back, even if it was just a shared meal. Amelia shook her head, but John wouldn't relent. He pushed the bowl toward her again, his gaze unwavering. "Eat a bit more. Share it with me," he insisted. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt as she accepted the spoon. She took a few bites, feeling the warmth spread through her body, the nourishment giving her the strength she didn't realize she desperately needed. She ate until half the bowl was gone, then handed it back to John, who watched her carefully, making sure she was satisfied before he finally began to eat. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if it was more than just food, it was hope. With each spoonful, he seemed to regain a bit more of himself, his hollow cheeks filling with color, and the dullness in his eyes lifting. "You're different from the people who pass by me on the street," Amelia, John said after a while, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "Most of them just ignore me, like I'm invisible. But you have a heart that this cruel world hasn't broken." His words were heavy with meaning, and they hung in the air between them, wrapping around Amelia like a warm embrace. She smiled, but it was a sad smile, tinged with the knowledge that the world had tried so many times to break her. "Maybe," she replied, her voice soft but resolute, "but I still have a lot to do." Helping John, even in such a small way, wasn't enough to change his situation entirely, but it was a start. A glimmer of hope, a reminder that kindness still existed in a world that often seemed too dark to bear. Returning home, Amelia's mind raced with plans. She needed to get more food, but she had to be clever, careful not to raise suspicion. Her parents were cruel and controlling, but they weren't omniscient. She would find a way to continue helping John without them noticing, determined not to let their cruelty dictate the person she was becoming. Her days, as always, were filled with endless chores, her body growing more exhausted with each task as her parents relaxed in their usual indifference. But that afternoon, when she finally retreated to her small room, something unexpected awaited her. On her bed sat a covered plate on a silver tray, the kind her parents usually reserved for themselves. Lifting the cover, Amelia's eyes widened in disbelief. There, laid out before her, was a meal far more exquisite than anything she was typically allowed to eat: fresh fruits, vibrant vegetables, tender cuts of meat, and even a delicate dessert in a small glass cup. She stared at it, wondering if she was dreaming, the sight of the food too surreal for her to fully comprehend. "Mother must have regretted slapping me over the porridge," Amelia thought, though the idea seemed impossible. Still, she couldn't resist. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling her body come alive again with the nourishment it had been denied for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt strong, as if she could take on the world and all its cruelty. But that strength was short-lived. The next morning, when Amelia slipped out of the house to bring John his porridge, the reality of the situation hit her harder than ever. The air had turned bitterly cold overnight, her breath visible in the frigid morning air. She had been even more careful this time, ensuring that no one noticed the extra food she had made. But when she reached the shack, she found John huddled under his thin blankets, shivering uncontrollably. The advancing winter had arrived, and with it, a cold so harsh that it crept into the bones, especially in the poorly insulated shack that offered little protection from the elements. Amelia's heart sank as she looked at him, knowing that the porridge she brought wouldn't be enough to keep him warm. She knelt beside him, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. "John," she whispered, touching his arm gently. "I brought you food, but you're freezing. We need to find a way to keep you warm, or this winter will only get worse." John looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude despite the discomfort. "Thank you, Amelia. I don't know what I'd do without you," he said, his voice weak but filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the food she had brought. It was her kindness, her presence, that kept him going. Amelia smiled faintly, the same sadness tugging at the corners of her lips. She couldn't change the world, but she could change this moment. She would do whatever it took to protect him, just as she had protected herself for so long. "You need more than this to stay warm," Amelia whispered, her voice filled with helplessness, even as she steeled herself to take action. She couldn't stand by and do nothing, not when the cold was becoming as dangerous as hunger. That afternoon, while her parents were out, she climbed up to the attic, her heart pounding with every step. The attic was filled with old, forgotten things, clothes, blankets, items her parents hadn't touched in years. But each piece she placed into the bag made her more nervous, the weight of the risk growing heavier with every item. "They can't notice these are missing," she thought, carefully choosing less noticeable pieces, things her parents wouldn't immediately miss. With the heavy bag slung over her shoulders, Amelia slipped out of the house under the cover of night. Each step toward the shack was a calculated risk, her senses heightened by the fear of being caught. The wind howled around her, cutting through her thin coat, but she pressed on, her determination keeping her warm. When she finally reached the shack, she opened the door as quietly as possible, revealing John still huddled in the corner, shivering beneath his thin blankets. "I brought something for you," she whispered, placing the bag on the floor with careful silence. John's eyes widened as he looked inside, the sight of the warm clothes and blankets filling him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Amelia, this is too much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you get all this?" His question was filled with both concern and wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe someone would go to such lengths for him. Amelia sat beside him, gently helping him wrap himself in the thickest blanket. The warmth it provided was immediate, a small but significant comfort against the biting cold. "Don't worry about that," she said, forcing a smile, even as her heart raced with the fear of being discovered. "Just use them to stay warm, okay?" John reached out, his cold fingers brushing against hers, the touch grounding them both in that moment of shared vulnerability. "You do so much for me, Amelia," he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers with a depth of emotion that made her heart ache. "Why bother?" She looked down at their hands, intertwined in a gesture that felt both fragile and strong at the same time. The answer came to her not from her mind, but from her heart, a truth she had always known deep down. "Because I would want someone to do the same for me if I were in your place," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her words. It wasn't just about survival, it was about humanity, about holding on to the belief that kindness could still exist in a world that seemed so devoid of it. John squeezed her hand, his gratitude and resolve shining through his tired eyes. "I will never forget this, Amelia. Never," he promised, his voice filled with sincerity. The warmth between them wasn't just from the blankets or clothes, it was the bond that was forming, a connection of mutual care and compassion that transcended their dire circumstances. Amelia nodded, feeling a swell of emotion rise within her. She had never imagined that helping someone else could make her feel so alive, so connected to something greater than herself. As she quietly left the shack, the tension in her chest grew. Her mind raced with worries. What would happen if her parents discovered what she had done? What if they found the attic items missing? Every step back toward her house heightened her fear, her senses on high alert. The moon, once her silent ally, was now obscured by dark clouds, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The wind blew colder, biting at her skin, as if whispering a warning of trouble yet to come. Her thoughts spiraled into worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. She imagined her parents' anger, the harsh punishments they would unleash if they found out. But alongside the fear, there was also a strange calm certainty that, no matter the cost, she had done the right thing. The fear of retribution couldn't extinguish the quiet pride she felt for helping John, for making a difference, however small, in his life. As soon as Amelia slipped quietly through the back door, she was met with the low murmur of voices drifting from the living room. Her heart sank. Her parents had returned earlier than she had anticipated. Panic seized her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She froze in place, her mind racing for a solution. But before she could think of one, her mother's sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "It's too quiet here. Where's that girl?" Her mother's tone was edged with suspicion, sending a cold shiver down Amelia's spine. Her heart pounded wildly as she frantically hid the empty bag under an old piece of furniture in the laundry room. She could feel the seconds slipping away as she tried to steady her breathing, then hurried to the kitchen, doing her best to look calm and composed. "I'm here, Mother. Just finishing up cleaning the kitchen," she called out, forcing a casual tone into her voice, though the tremor in her words betrayed the fear lurking beneath. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her gaze heavy with suspicion, scanning the room as if searching for signs of deception. "You were outside, weren't you?" she accused, her eyes narrowing into thin slits. The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Amelia could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. A cold dread crept through her veins. "No, Mother," she lied, her voice shaking despite her efforts to stay composed. "I've been here the whole time." The words felt weak on her tongue, as though her fear might give her away. Her mother's gaze sharpened. "Don't lie to me, girl. Your father saw footprints in the grass outside, footprints leading to the shack," she hissed, her tone dripping with venomous threat. "You know what happens to lying women, don't you?" Amelia swallowed hard, her throat dry and her stomach twisting into knots. She knew all too well what her mother meant, and the thought of facing her wrath again terrified her. "Sorry, Mother," she stammered, scrambling to come up with a believable excuse. "I just went to check if we left any tools outside with the rain forecasted." Her parents exchanged skeptical glances, their doubt evident. Amelia's father stepped into the kitchen, his expression dark with warning. "Let's just hope that's all it was," he said, his voice low and menacing. Her mother's cold smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're watching you, Amelia," she said with a finality that sent a wave of dread washing over her. "One slip, and there will be consequences." With that, they left her. But the unease lingered long after they were gone. When Amelia finally made it to her room, she heard the familiar click of the lock behind her, a reminder that her parents saw her as little more than a prisoner in their home. She stared at the locked door for a moment, feeling a deep sense of isolation settle over her like a heavy blanket. Turning to the window, she watched as the snow began to fall gently, coating the ground in a soft, white blanket. The peaceful scene outside was in stark contrast to the turmoil churning within her. She couldn't stop thinking about John, out there in the shack, exposed to the unforgiving winter cold. Every flake that fell seemed to deepen her worry, and the piercing chill of the impending storm only added to her fear. She knew that with every passing minute, John's situation was growing more dire. The snowstorm that had been announced loomed over her like a terrible omen, making her visits to the shack feel not only risky but dangerously close to impossible. She paced her small room, anxiety gnawing at her insides. Her parents' vigilance would be even stricter now, their eyes sharper, their suspicions heightened. But how could she stay here, warm and safe, while John struggled to survive in the brutal cold? The thought of him suffering out there alone filled her with a crushing sense of responsibility. Amelia sat by the window, her eyes following the falling snow, her mind racing to find a solution. She couldn't let the storm or her parents' threats stop her. John's life depended on her, and she wouldn't abandon him, no matter the risk. That night, the urgency gnawed at Amelia's heart like never before. The snow continued to fall heavily outside, and the bitter cold only deepened her worry for John. She paced back and forth, staring out the window at the snow-covered ground below. She measured the height of the jump in her mind, a risky distance, but the stakes were too high to be cautious. She knew that if she didn't reach John soon, he might not survive the night. Desperation fueled her determination as she whispered a prayer under her breath. "My God, please don't let me get hurt." "John needs me," she prayed, summoning every ounce of courage she had. Without allowing herself time to second-guess her decision, Amelia flung open the window and jumped. The cold air rushed past her as she fell, her heart pounding in her chest. She hit the ground with a thud, bracing for pain, but none came. Whether it was divine intervention or pure luck, she couldn't say, but she was unscathed. Her legs trembled as she stood up, but she wasted no time. She needed to reach John before it was too late. When she finally arrived at the shack, her heart nearly stopped at the sight before her. John lay pale and delirious, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His coughs were weak and ragged, each one sounding like it cost him every bit of strength he had left. His skin was cold and clammy, and he could barely keep his eyes open. "Amelia, I don't think I'm going to last much longer," he murmured between painful coughs. Each word was a struggle, and his voice was laced with a resignation that tore at her soul. Desperation surged through Amelia like a tidal wave. "Don't say that, John," she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear and determination. "I brought medicine and a warm blanket. You're going to get better." She tried to sound hopeful, tried to convince both him and herself that everything would be okay, but deep down, her heart clenched with dread. John's hand found hers, his grip weak but filled with gratitude. A faint, almost ghostly smile touched his lips. "You are an angel, Amelia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for everything, for not leaving me alone here." His eyes fluttered shut, as if he were ready to give in to the inevitable, a peaceful acceptance settling over his features. Amelia's heart shattered at the sight. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision as she desperately tried to help John take the medicine she had brought. "You need to fight, John," she insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here with you. Please, stay with me." Her words were more than just encouragement, they were a plea, a prayer, a desperate hope that she wouldn't lose him here, alone and forgotten by the world. She stayed with him for nearly an hour, despite knowing the risk she was taking by being away from home for so long. She watched over him as the medicine slowly took effect, her heart pounding with each breath he took. Gradually, the color began to return to his face, and his breathing steadied. When John finally opened his eyes, Amelia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Their gazes met, and for the first time, Amelia noticed how handsome John was beneath the weariness and suffering. His once tired eyes now gleamed with life, and there was something gentle in the way he looked at her, something she hadn't expected. A small, warm smile curved his lips, and he whispered, "You are my salvation, Amelia." Her heart skipped a beat at his words, but reality quickly intruded. She knew that John wouldn't survive another night in the freezing shack. The winter storm outside was worsening, and staying here would only put him in greater danger. She made a swift decision. She would hide him in the attic of her house, at least until the storm passed. It was risky, but it was the only way she could protect him from the cold. With newfound resolve, Amelia helped John to his feet, wrapping him tightly in the blankets she had brought. She led him back toward her home, carefully avoiding any signs that could alert her parents. The wind whipped around them, But Amelia kept moving, determined to get John to safety. As they approached the house, however, her heart sank. The front door was ajar, and a figure stood in the doorway. It was her mother, holding one of the empty medicine packages Amelia had left behind, her face a mask of fury. "What is this?" Amelia, her mother, demanded, her voice sharp and rising with each syllable. She stepped closer, waving the medicine package in front of Amelia's face. "And don't you dare come up with excuses this time." Caught off guard, Amelia felt a wave of panic surge through her. Her hands trembled, and the cold was no longer just from the winter air, it was from fear. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words that would save her. I was feeling unwell. "Mother," she stammered, her voice weak. "I thought that." Lies, her mother cut her off, her face inches from Amelia's now. Her eyes blazed with anger, the kind of anger that Amelia had feared her whole life. "Your father saw you going toward the street when he thought we were in our room. Who were you meeting, Amelia? What are you hiding?" Amelia's mind raced. She could feel John's presence behind her, just out of sight, but so close to being discovered. The tension in the air was suffocating, and she knew that any wrong move could lead to disaster for both of them. Amelia's heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. One wrong word, one misplaced step, and it wouldn't just be her who suffered. John's life was in danger too. Her mind scrambled for something, anything, that would defuse the situation. "There's no one, Mother, I swear," she blurted out, her voice quick and uneven, betraying her fear despite her best efforts to remain calm. Her mother's eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. "We'll see about that," she said with a chilling finality, grabbing Amelia by the arm with a vice-like grip. She began dragging her toward the shack, each of Amelia's steps heavy with dread. Her heart pounded in her chest, loud and insistent, as if it might give her away at any moment. Every step closer to the shack felt like a step closer to doom. She couldn't help but imagine what would happen if they found John there, how her mother's fury would rain down on both of them. When they finally reached the shack, Amelia's heart felt like it would burst from the tension. Her mother threw open the door, and Amelia's breath caught in her throat. But to her shock, John wasn't there. The small space was empty, and her heart plunged into a deeper fear. Where had he gone? Was he all right? Her eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for any sign of where John might be. But there was nothing, just the cold emptiness that mirrored the fear gnawing at her insides. Her mother, mistaking Amelia's panic for guilt, yanked her back toward the house. "We didn't find anyone today," she spat, "but this isn't over." The threat lingered in the air, thick and menacing. When they returned home, her mother locked Amelia in her room once again, trapping her in a cage of fear and helplessness. That night, sleep was impossible. Amelia lay awake, her thoughts spiraling into darker and darker places. Where was John? Was he safe? Had he gone looking for help in his weakened state, only to collapse somewhere in the cold? Or worse, had he succumbed to his illness, lost and alone? The thought was unbearable. As the hours dragged on, she began to feel the sharp onset of chills, her body racked with fever. A deep ache settled in her chest, each breath a painful reminder that she couldn't afford to get sick, not now, not when John needed her. "I can't get sick now," she whispered to herself, forcing her aching body to sit up. She wrapped herself in the thickest coat she could find, though it did little to stave off the shivers that racked her frame. She waited, tense and watchful, for the right moment to escape again. Her mother was distracted, engrossed in her television shows, and Amelia seized the opportunity. She grabbed a pot of hot soup and some hidden medicine, her hands trembling with fever and fear, and slipped out into the cold once more. The wind was biting, cruel against her fevered skin, but she pushed through it, driven by the need to reach John. She stumbled through the snow, her vision swimming as the fever took its toll, but she kept moving, kept pushing forward. When she finally reached the shack, she hesitated only for a moment before softly calling out, "John, are you here?" Immense relief flooded through her when she saw him lying beneath the blankets, still weak but alive. The sight of him, breathing and conscious, was a balm to her frayed nerves. "Amelia, you look terrible. What are you doing here in this state?" John's voice was filled with concern as he saw her pale face, her body trembling with fever. She tried to smile, though it came out weak and strained. "I had to come," she said, her voice hoarse. "You need to eat something." She handed him the pot of soup and the medicine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them steady. John accepted the offerings, his eyes never leaving her face. He could see how much she was struggling, and it pained him to see her like this. "You need to rest, Amelia. You're burning up with fever," he said, his voice full of worry. Amelia sat beside him, trying to mask the severity of her condition. "Just rest, John. We both need to," she replied, though her voice faltered, betraying the weakness she was trying so hard to hide. She felt her strength slipping away, the fever pulling her deeper into its grip, but she forced herself to stay awake, to stay vigilant. She couldn't afford to let go. Not now, not when both of their lives depended on it. Amelia struggled through the darkness, each step more difficult than the last as the cold and fatigue consumed her. The snow beneath her feet felt like an endless sea of ice, and the world around her began to blur, spinning dangerously as her body gave in to exhaustion and illness. She fell into the snow, her consciousness slipping away as the storm raged on. Her last thought before the darkness took her was a desperate hope that John would somehow be all right. Meanwhile, back in the shack, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Worry gnawed at him until he could no longer stay still. Despite the risk, he ventured out into the storm to see if Amelia had made it home safely. When he found her lying unconscious in the snow, a wave of anguish and fear washed over him. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable, and the thought of losing her after all she had done for him was unbearable. Summoning what little strength he had left, John lifted Amelia into his arms. She was so light, her body limp and cold against him. He carried her back to the shack with great effort, his breath labored and his muscles burning from the strain. Once inside, he used every resource he had to warm her, rubbing her hands, wrapping her in all the blankets he could find, whispering words of comfort, even though she couldn't hear them. "You saved my life so many times, Amelia," he murmured softly, watching her pale face with concern. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." The storm outside raged on, but inside the shack, John remained vigilant, his eyes never leaving her as he cared for her through the night. Her breaths were shallow, but they continued, and that was enough to keep his hope alive. As the hours passed, John noticed something that filled him with shock and anger. Beneath Amelia's clothes, he saw the bruises on her body, evidence of the abuse she had endured. He hadn't known, hadn't imagined that this strong, compassionate young woman was suffering so much at the hands of others. The realization hit him hard, and with it came a fierce determination. He would not allow her to continue living in such cruelty. She had saved him, and now he would do whatever it took to save her. By morning, Amelia began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and she slowly became aware of the warmth around her, the softness of the blankets cocooning her weakened body. John's presence beside her brought a sense of comfort that she hadn't known in a long time. He had stayed by her side, caring for her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. As her vision cleared, she noticed a carefully folded piece of paper beside her makeshift bed. With trembling hands, she picked it up and unfolded it, her heart racing as she read John's words. "My dear Amelia," the letter began. "You gave me something I thought I had lost long ago, hope and a reason to fight. I can't let you continue to suffer alone. I won't let them hurt you. I'm leaving to resolve everything, to give us a chance at a better life far from the cruelty you've known. I promise I will come back for you, and together we will find peace. With all my love, John." Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes as she read the letter, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and fear. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of John's love and his promise to protect her. How can I deserve so much, she wondered, overwhelmed by gratitude and worry. He had left to fight for their future, to ensure her safety, and now she was more determined than ever to hold on, to endure whatever was necessary until he returned. But the harsh reality of her situation quickly set in. Fear gnawed at her, fear of what her parents might do if they found out she had left the house during the night, fear that her escape could put both her and John in greater danger. She sighed with relief when she saw that her parents hadn't noticed her absence. Her door was still locked from the outside, just as it had been before she left. It seemed they hadn't even bothered to check on her. Amelia knew she had to be careful. She couldn't afford any more risks, not if it meant jeopardizing the chance of reuniting with John. She resumed her usual chores, keeping her head down to avoid suspicion, but fate was not kind. That same afternoon, as she tried to keep up the appearance of normalcy, her mother found the letter. "What is this?" her mother screamed, her voice filled with tempestuous fury as she brandished the letter in front of Amelia. Her face twisted in anger, and her eyes burned with accusation. "Who is John, and what does he want with you?" Amelia froze, terror paralyzing her as her mother's rage grew. "You think you can deceive us? Bringing strangers into our lives, planning to run away with him." "No, Mother, please," Amelia pleaded, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. John is a homeless man. I helped him." Her words were cut off by a harsh slap across her face. The sting of it was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped her heart. "A beggar," her mother sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You were giving our food to him, weren't you?" Her father entered the room, drawn by the commotion. He looked at the letter, then at Amelia, his expression darkening. Her mother continued, "We don't want to be involved with people like him. We're leaving the city. Let's go before this man comes back to take our daughter." She turned to Amelia's father with a determined look. "We can stay at your parents' country house until he gives up." Amelia felt her world collapse around her. "No, we can't leave. Please, I need to wait for him," she begged, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Her parents were already packing their belongings, determined to cut any ties she had to John. They were resolute in their decision, and no amount of begging could change their minds. As the house filled with the chaotic sounds of preparation for their imminent departure, Amelia sat in a daze, clutching John's letter tightly in her hands. She felt utterly helpless, trapped in a situation beyond her control. "Come back soon, please," she whispered to the paper, her voice a quiet prayer as tears slipped down her cheeks. She could only hope that John would return before it was too late, before they took her away from the only chance at freedom she had ever known. Amidst the frantic preparations for their departure, Amelia felt the weight of urgency pressing down on her. She had to act now, or the small sliver of hope she had left would vanish entirely. Her parents were distracted, busy packing, and in that brief moment of opportunity, she formulated a desperate plan. She needed to hide, to find a place where she could wait for John somewhere her parents wouldn't think to look. With her heart pounding in her chest, Amelia slipped out of the room, her steps careful but quick, her mind racing with the need to escape. But just as she reached the back door, her father's voice pierced through the silence like a blade. "Where do you think you're going?" His tone was harsh, filled with authority and anger. Amelia froze, caught in the act. Slowly she turned to face him, her heart thudding wildly in her chest. Her fear was overwhelming, but beneath it, a resolve had taken root. She stood tall, her face set with determination, even though her voice trembled. "I'm not going with you," she said, her words carrying both defiance and desperation. "I can't leave my life, or John behind." Her father's face darkened with fury, his eyes narrowing as he stepped toward her. "You don't have a choice, Amelia. We're doing this for your own good," he snapped. reaching out to grab her. But Amelia backed away, her pulse quickening as she felt the walls closing in around her. Without another word, she turned and ran back inside the house, her mind scrambling for a plan. She needed to hide, to find somewhere they wouldn't think to look for her, at least long enough for her to figure out her next move. The attic, dusty, forgotten, and rarely visited, came to mind. She slipped up the narrow stairs, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she crouched behind a stack of old boxes, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. But her hiding place was short-lived. Before long, she heard the heavy footsteps of her parents searching for her. It didn't take them long to find her, and when they did, her mother held John's letter in her hands, her face twisted into a bitter smile of triumph. "This ends now," her mother declared coldly, holding the letter up as if it were nothing more than a scrap of paper. Without hesitation, she tore it into pieces, each fragment falling like a death sentence to the floor. Amelia's heart shattered as she watched her only connection to John, the words that had given her hope, turn to ash in the fireplace. The devastation was overwhelming, but she couldn't speak, couldn't cry out. She was too numb with shock. Her parents didn't give her a chance to resist. They grabbed her forcefully, dragging her out of the house and shoving her into the car. The drive to her grandparents' old country house was silent and suffocating, the weight of their decision pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Amelia knew that once they arrived, there would be no way out. The old house was isolated, decrepit, and nearly impossible to escape from. Every kilometer they drove felt like another nail being hammered into her coffin, sealing her fate away from John. When they finally arrived, they led her up to a small room on the second floor. The window was barred, and when she looked out, all she could see was the bleak landscape stretching out into the distance. The drop was too high to jump, and the bars were too close together for her to squeeze through. She was trapped, and the realization of her situation hit her like a wave of despair. Sitting by the window, Amelia looked out at the horizon, her eyes searching for any sign of hope, but there was none. "I've lost John," she whispered to the cold wind outside, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Now he'll never find me, and I'll never escape the battle she had fought so hard to maintain her freedom." Her future with John felt like it had come to an end. There were no more chances, no more escape plans. She was imprisoned, both physically and emotionally, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her like a crushing burden. But Amelia wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Her love for John fueled her determination, and as her mind raced, she began to search for anything that might help her escape. Her eyes landed on a small hairpin lying on the floor. Picking it up, she held it in her trembling hands, her fingers working desperately to manipulate the lock on the door. Each failed attempt tightened the grip of fear around her heart. What if she never saw John again? What if this was the end of everything she had fought for? Amelia refused to accept that. She couldn't give up. With every ounce of strength she had left, she continued to work on the lock, her hands shaking with urgency and fear. She had to escape, had to find a way back to John. Even if the world seemed determined to keep them apart, she wouldn't stop fighting. "I need to get out of here," Amelia whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the cold, silent room. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to contain the panic rising within her. She had spent what felt like an eternity trying to unlock the door with the hairpin, each failed attempt chipping away at her hope. When the hairpin finally broke, a wave of frustration and helplessness crashed over her, and she backed away, sinking to the floor with her back pressed against the cold wall. "This can't be happening," she murmured, her words lost in the emptiness of the room. The reality of her situation was sinking in, suffocating her with its weight. She was trapped, isolated in this dilapidated old cabin, with no way out and no one to help her. The cabin became a temporary refuge, but also a prison of fear and anguish. Huddled in a corner, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, Amelia listened to the wind howling through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Each gust felt like a cruel reminder of her desperate situation, a constant reminder that she was alone and cut off from the world. The isolation was unbearable, and she feared that her parents might forget her entirely, leaving her to starve in this forgotten place. She couldn't understand how her parents could hate her so much, how they could be so cruel. Their voices, though distant, echoed in her mind, filled with venom and malice. She needs to learn once and for all that she can't defy our authority. Her mother's cold, severe voice rang in her ears, followed by her father's low, threatening growl. This time she'll feel the strength of our hand. Amelia trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks as the weight of their words crushed her spirit. She had always known her parents were harsh, but this was something else entirely. As she huddled in the corner, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "How much do you think she's worth?" her mother asked, her voice devoid of any warmth or humanity. The question hung in the air, a dark and terrible revelation that sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through Amelia's body. "My mother wants to sell me," she thought, her heart pounding in disbelief. How could they even consider such a thing? But the conversation outside continued, confirming her worst fears. "I don't know. We'll have to ask and find out," her father replied, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Amelia's heart shattered as she realized the depths of their betrayal. They weren't just punishing her, they were planning to get rid of her entirely, to sell her like she was nothing more than a piece of property. Terror gripped her, suffocating her as she curled up tighter, trying to push away the horrifying thoughts that threatened to consume her. She knew she was in serious trouble, and she couldn't afford to stay there any longer. Every minute she spent in that cabin was a minute gained against the fate her parents had planned for her, but it was also a minute lost, a minute further away from John. "He'll be looking for me," she whispered to herself, trying to hold on to the hope that John hadn't given up on her. "I need to find a way to get back to him." The solitude of the cabin, though oppressive, gave her the space she needed to think and plan. She knew that escape wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't allow herself to give in to despair. Her mind raced, searching for a solution, for some way to let John know where she was and warn him of the danger she was in. She glanced at the barred window, her only connection to the outside world, and it became the focal point of her thoughts. It was an obstacle, but perhaps also an opportunity. The bars were too close together for her to squeeze through, and the drop was too high to jump safely. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to use the window to her advantage. She studied it carefully, looking for any weakness, any possibility that she could exploit. Even a small signal, something that could catch John's attention if he came near, might be enough. "I need to find a way," she whispered again, determination hardening in her chest. She wouldn't let her parents decide her fate. She wouldn't let them destroy her future with John. No matter what it took, she would find a way to escape this nightmare and reunite with the only person who had ever shown her kindness. As night descended, the cold crept deeper into the cabin, wrapping Amelia in its icy grip. Shivering, she crawled toward the small, broken fireplace that stood unused in the corner. She scavenged for bits of wood, broken pieces scattered around the cabin, remnants of a forgotten past. With trembling hands, she managed to light a fire, the flickering flames casting a dim, warm glow that brought a fragile sense of relief. The warmth was faint, but it was enough to soothe her aching body, enough to kindle a small spark of hope in her heart. "God, please help me. Make John find me," she whispered into the quiet night, her eyes locked on the dancing shadows that played on the cabin walls. The uncertainty of her fate pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, but deep within her, the determination to survive burned just as fiercely as the fire she had kindled. She held on to that determination, praying that somehow, against all odds, she would find her way back to John. Exhausted, Amelia eventually drifted into a restless sleep, the warmth of the fire lulling her into fragile dreams of freedom. In her dreams, she saw herself running through open fields. The weight of her parents' control finally lifted, and John standing at the end of the path, waiting for her with open arms. Tomorrow, she told herself as she dozed off. Tomorrow, maybe I'll find a way to escape when they bring me food. But as dawn lingered in the early hours of the morning, Amelia's sleep was interrupted by a distant sound of a car approaching. Her eyes flew open, her heart leaping at the thought of someone coming to help her. She scrambled to her feet, racing to the barred window. She banged on it, but then stopped, fear clutching at her as she realized the danger. What if her parents heard her? What if they caught her trying to get attention? The consequences would be severe. Instead, she stood still, her breath fogging the cold glass as she peered out into the dim light of the morning, straining to see who was arriving. She watched as the car parked, the engine cutting off, and a well-dressed man stepped out. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. He was a stranger in polished shoes, a sleek suit, and with an air of confidence that didn't match the John she knew. But then he turned, and their eyes met. Amelia's heart nearly stopped. It was John, but not as she remembered him. He had transformed, and everything about him was different: his clothes, his posture, the way he carried himself. He looked like a man with power, a man who had control over his own fate. Tears of relief welled up in Amelia's eyes as she pressed her face against the bars, watching him approach the cabin door. How did he get those clothes? And that car? What's happening, she wondered, her mind racing with questions. As John made his way to the front door, Amelia's parents emerged from the house, clearly surprised and suspicious of the visitor. She could see everything from her window, though they couldn't see her, hidden away in the shadows of the cabin. "Who are you? What do you want here?" her father growled, his voice laced with hostility. He stood tall, trying to assert his authority, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes as he took in John's appearance. John's gaze remained steady, unflinching as he faced them. "I've come for Amelia," he declared, his voice firm and resolute. "I'm John," he added, letting the name sink in, "and I'm here to take her." Amelia's heart raced as she watched the confrontation unfold, hope surging within her. She clutched the bars of the window tightly, tears streaming down her face. John had come for her. He had found her, just as she had prayed, and now he was standing up to the people who had kept her imprisoned for so long. Amelia strained to hear through the thick walls of the old house. She could barely make out their voices as they spoke below, but she caught enough to sense the tension. Her mother's voice, dripping with cynicism, cut through the morning air. "You don't look like a beggar to me," she remarked, her tone sharp and mocking. "Do you think you can just come here and take our daughter?" John remained calm, standing tall in the face of their accusations. "Amelia deserves a better life than the one you offer her," he said, his voice steady but firm. "A life free from fear and violence. I have the means to take care of her, to give her what she deserves." Amelia's heart raced as she listened, knowing her parents would be weighing their options, perhaps even thinking of how they could profit from the situation. They didn't care about her, they never had. She imagined the cold exchange of glances between her parents, their minds already calculating. "And if we refuse?" her father challenged, his voice thick with defiance. John's response was unflinching, his voice as cold as the morning wind that whipped through the trees. "Then I will have to take legal action to ensure her safety," he said. "I will report everything I know about how you've treated Amelia to the authorities." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. She admired John's bravery, but fear clawed at her too. What if her parents retaliated? What if they hurt him or worse? She knew that confronting them was dangerous, but John had come prepared, his every step carefully planned. Her mother, sensing the power shift, attempted to regain control. Amelia went to live with her aunt in a very distant place, she lied, her voice taking on a false sweetness. She won't be coming back, so you can't take her. But if you want her to return, you'll have to reimburse us for everything we've done for her. We want compensation." John's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "Are you trying to sell your daughter?" he asked, disgust creeping into his voice. "Where's Amelia? I don't believe she's gone." He glanced past her parents, searching for any sign of Amelia, but she wasn't visible at the window. Her mother's expression hardened. "No, we're not selling her," she snapped. "We're simply asking for compensation. But I can see you're not the right person to help us. Get out of my house. Amelia is very far away, and you will never see her again." With that, she slammed the door in John's face, shutting him out with cruel finality. Amelia's world collapsed around her as she watched John's car begin to pull away from the old house. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, a chilling sentence of eternal isolation. Panic surged through her, and with her heart pounding, she rushed to the window. Desperation fueled her as she banged on the window bars with all her might, shouting John's name into the wind. "John! John, please don't go," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the car grow smaller. Each inch it moved away, carving a deeper wound of hopelessness into her heart. In the car, John felt a deep sense of unease gnawing at him. Something wasn't right. As he was about to accelerate, a faint sound, a cry, nearly swallowed by the wind, reached his ears. He braked abruptly, his intuition screaming at him that something was wrong. His heart racing, he leaped out of the car, sprinting back toward the house. Amelia continued pounding on the window, her body shaking from cold and fear. The wind whipped through the trees, making it harder for her to see clearly, but suddenly through the fog, she saw John's silhouette emerge. He was running toward her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, hope surged within her. "John," she cried out again, her voice cracking with relief and urgency. She kept banging on the window, trying to keep his attention as he made his way closer. Every step he took toward her felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the abyss of despair she had been sinking into. John, breathless but determined, reached the house and began shouting for Amelia. He couldn't see her yet, but he knew she was here, somewhere inside, waiting for him. "Amelia!" John shouted back, his voice filled with desperation as he spotted her at the barred window. Relief washed over him when their eyes met, but it was quickly replaced by an urgency to get her out of there. "John, help me!" Amelia cried, her words barely making it through her sobs. She clung to the bars, feeling a mixture of hope and fear as she watched him take action. John marched up to the door, his determination burning in his eyes, and began pounding against the wood with all his strength. "Release her," he demanded, his voice strong and unyielding. "You have no right to imprison her like this. Amelia deserves to be free, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure that." Amelia's parents, furious and defensive, stormed out of the house to confront him. Her mother's face twisted with rage as she jabbed a finger toward John's chest. "Do you think we'll let you take her? Amelia will never go with you. You're trespassing on our property." She spat, her voice dripping with venom. But John stood his ground, undeterred by her threats. "I will not leave until Amelia is free. If you try to stop me, I'll make sure the law is on my side." "You can't keep her prisoner any longer," he replied, his voice cold and steady. Amelia, watching the heated argument from the window, felt her heart pounding in her chest. She was filled with a sense of helplessness as she listened to the confrontation below. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to get downstairs, to be part of her own escape, but the bars on the window reminded her of her captivity. The tension between John and her parents reached a breaking point, voices rising as the argument escalated. In the chaos, one of the neighbors must have called the police, because soon enough, the sound of sirens cut through the air. The officers arrived, quickly assessing the situation. The sight of Amelia at the barred window, the shouting, and John's insistent demands for her freedom were enough for them to intervene. Amelia's parents were taken into custody, their protests and threats falling on deaf ears as the officers led them away. As soon as Amelia was freed, John ran to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you hurt? Did they hurt you, Amelia?" he asked, his hands gently cradling her face as if she might break under his touch. "I'm fine now," she replied, her voice trembling with relief, but her eyes still clouded with the weight of everything that had happened. She looked past John to see her parents being escorted to the police cars, their faces a mix of anger and fear. The realization that she was finally free hit her like a wave, and she nearly collapsed into John's arms, overwhelmed by the emotions crashing over her. At the police station, while giving her statement, Amelia made a surprising decision. When asked if she wanted to press further charges against her parents, she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "I just want to move on with my life, away from the hatred and suffering they caused me." Her words took the officers by surprise, but Amelia had made her choice. She didn't want revenge, she wanted freedom. John stood by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. He held her hand, a small gesture that meant everything in that moment. "We're going to start a new life together, Amelia," he promised softly, his voice filled with warmth and hope. "A life where you can be free to be who you truly are. You'll have everything you've ever wanted, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Amelia looked up at him, tears in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of peace, a glimpse of the future she had always dreamed of. With John by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. Amelia approached her decision with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She wanted peace, the kind of peace that came with living a normal life, studying, working, building a family. She knew the pain and hurt had to stop somewhere, so she chose not to press charges against her parents. But even her act of kindness couldn't spare them from the consequences. The police had found her locked away in dangerous conditions, and her parents were imprisoned for their actions. As they left the police station, Amelia had a whirlwind of questions for John, but he remained quiet, guiding her to a car that took them to a massive mansion. The sight of it left her speechless. It was as if she had stepped into a fairy tale, a place so luxurious and grand that she couldn't quite believe it was real. As she followed John inside, Amelia felt a strange sense of being in a different world altogether, one far removed from the struggles and hardships she had known her entire life. "John, this is incredible," she finally said, her voice filled with wonder. "But why did you never tell me about all this? Whose house is this? How did you get that car and all this?" She couldn't hide the curiosity and apprehension that laced her words. Despite her growing feelings for John, she feared that the secrets he had kept might change everything between them. John sighed deeply, stopping in front of one of the large windows that offered a breathtaking view of the illuminated gardens. The silence stretched for a moment before he began to speak, his voice heavy with the weight of past experiences. "I needed to know that you saw me beyond my money, Amelia. My life, despite all the comfort and luxury, has been marked by loneliness and betrayal. People have always expected something from me, something other than my company. They only cared about what I could provide, not who I really am." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "And when I least expected it, they would deceive me. They'd pretend to care, but it was always about the money. It happened so often that I began to believe that my wealth was a curse, that it only brought me sadness and surrounded me with bad people." John paused, glancing back out at the garden, the memories clearly weighing on him. "So I decided I didn't want this life anymore. I donated most of my fortune to those in need, thinking that if I had nothing left, I might finally find someone who would care for me for who I am, not for what I can give them." He took a deep breath, his gaze distant. "I thought living with nothing would give me a chance to find real connections. But I was wrong. When I had no money, people ignored me just the same. No one listened, no one cared until you came along. I don't know what made me approach you. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe it was just a desperate hope that you were different. Amelia listened intently, her heart aching for him. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the tension in his fingers. "I still don't understand," she said gently. "Why would you put yourself through that kind of suffering? You almost died when you got sick." John turned back to her, a sadness in his eyes that spoke of deeper pain. "I didn't plan to get sick," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But in a way, it made me see things more clearly. When you helped me, Amelia, it wasn't because you wanted something from me. You didn't even know who I was. You helped because you cared. You were the first person in so long who saw me as a person, not as a wallet. And that's why I had to keep my past a secret until I knew I could trust you." Amelia felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of understanding. She realized that John had been searching for something real, just as she had. "I don't care about the money, John," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "I care about you. The man who stood by me, who fought for my freedom, who believed in me when no one else did." John smiled at her, a warmth returning to his eyes. "And that's all I've ever wanted, Amelia. To be loved for who I am, not for what I can give. Now that we've found each other, I promise you this: I will do everything in my power to give you the life you deserve. A life filled with love, freedom, and happiness." Amelia leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in her life, she felt truly safe. She had found not just a protector in John, but a partner, someone who understood her struggles and who had faced his own battles to find the truth in life. Together, they would build a future free from the chains of the past, a future where love and trust could finally flourish. John held Amelia's hand tightly as they strolled through the garden, the warmth of the setting sun bathing them in a soft glow. The newly married couple walked slowly, savoring the peaceful moment after what felt like a lifetime of struggles. The gentle breeze carried with it the scent of blooming flowers, adding a sense of serenity to their quiet happiness. "You changed my life too," Amelia, John replied, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "You showed me that even in the darkest times, there's still light if you're willing to find it. That night on the street, I had lost hope in humanity. But then you came along and reminded me that there's still kindness, still goodness in this world. And that's all I needed to believe again." Amelia smiled, her heart full as she looked up at him. "I never imagined my life would turn out this way. I thought I would always be stuck in that house, living under the shadow of fear and control. But then you appeared, and everything changed." John stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gently cupping her face. "I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to live in fear again. I want to make you happy, Amelia, and build a future where love is at the center of everything we do." Amelia leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his love envelop her. "You've already made me happier than I ever thought possible, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I can't wait to see what the future holds for us." They continued their walk, reflecting on how far they had come. From the cold, dark streets to the warm embrace of their new life together, every step had brought them closer to the happiness they now shared. Amelia had started studying, fulfilling her lifelong dream of gaining an education. John had been her constant support, cheering her on and believing in her potential. Together, they had created a life that was rich not in material wealth, but in love and purpose. Their wedding had been a simple, intimate ceremony, just as they had wanted. Surrounded by a few close friends, they had promised to love and protect each other for the rest of their lives. The simplicity of it all had made it even more meaningful. No grand gestures, just the purest expression of love between two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way. As they reached the end of the garden path, Amelia paused to take it all in. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had led her to a place of peace and fulfillment she had never thought possible. She looked at John, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. To think it all started with an act of kindness on a dark street, Amelia reflected, her voice filled with wonder. I can't believe how much our lives have changed. John smiled, pulling her closer. That act of kindness saved us both, Amelia. It led us here, to this life, to each other. And I'll always be grateful for that moment, for the chance to love you. They stood together in the fading light, their hands intertwined, knowing that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. Their love, born out of compassion and strength, had healed their wounds and given them both a second chance at happiness. And with that love, they were ready to build a future filled with hope, joy, and endless possibilities. Now, Amelia stood tall and confident, her once frail and weary body transformed into a picture of strength and health. She wore refined clothes that reflected the life she had built with John. But what mattered most to her was that she was finally loved and cherished by someone who truly saw her for who she was. John, always by her side, held her hand tenderly, his smile full of admiration and gratitude. You gave me something worth fighting for, Amelia, John said softly, his eyes locking with hers. You gave me a reason to believe in good again, and now together we can offer that same hope to others. Driven by this shared mission, Amelia and John founded a charity dedicated to helping those in vulnerable situations, people who, like John, had once been overlooked and forgotten. The project, aptly named Light for Tomorrow, grew rapidly, fueled by the couple's unwavering commitment and John's generosity. For John, philanthropy became his true calling, a way to use his wealth to create meaningful change. Let's call it Light for Tomorrow, Amelia had suggested one evening during one of their planning meetings, because everyone deserves a chance at a new beginning, no matter how dark their past has been. John had smiled at her, admiration shining in his eyes. It's perfect, he had said, his voice filled with warmth. You are the light of my tomorrow, Amelia. Over time, Light for Tomorrow blossomed into a beacon of hope for countless individuals. The institution helped transform lives, its positive impact rippling through the community. Amelia, never one to shy away from hard work, often found herself on the front lines, working directly with the people the charity aimed to help. She was a living reminder that change was possible, and her story became a source of inspiration for those who needed it most. 7 years later, on a warm and sunny afternoon, Amelia stood in the institution's yard, watching as children laughed and played together. She felt a small hand slip into hers and looked down to see her eldest son, his eyes full of curiosity and admiration. Mom, have you always been so brave? He asked, his innocent voice filled with wonder. Amelia knelt down so she could look him in the eyes, smiling as she spoke. I learned to be brave, sweetheart. Sometimes you have to be strong. Not just for yourself, but for others too. And when you do that, you can make a difference in the world. Her son smiled back at her, clearly proud of his mother, and Amelia felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over her. As her family grew, she never forgot the lessons of her past. The hardships she had endured were now distant memories, though they remained a reminder of how far she had come. Her parents remained in prison, a consequence of their actions, and they never had access to the life she had built with John, a decision that had been difficult, but one that protected the integrity and security of her new life. Amelia looked up and saw John playing with their children, laughter filling the air. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she watched him, knowing that together they had created something extraordinary. They hadn't just built a family based on love and mutual respect, they had built a legacy of kindness and generosity that extended far beyond their own home. John caught her gaze and smiled, walking over to her with an easy grace. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. We're making a difference, Amelia, she said, her voice filled with pride as she leaned into his embrace. "Yes, we are," John replied, kissing her gently. "And we will continue to always together." As they stood there, surrounded by the love they had built and the hope they had given to so many, Amelia and John looked to the future with a deep sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they could face them together. They had turned adversity into opportunity, and with each other by their side, they were ready to continue making a difference in the world, one act of kindness at a time. If you enjoyed Amelia and John's story, we invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to keep bringing you exciting and heartfelt stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. Each one is full of emotion, hope, and lessons that touch the heart. We are incredibly grateful to have you here with us on this journey. Now, you can click on the links appearing on the screen. We've put together a special selection just for you, filled with captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment. We hope you enjoy them as much as we do. Until next time. Now that you've heard Amelia and John's incredible journey, we want to hear from you. What have you learned from their story? Please share one thing you will bring to practice in your life below this video. Your thoughts can inspire others on their own paths of growth and healing. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're excited to bring you more heartfelt and captivating stories, so stay tuned for our next video.